I'm Emily Hartman, 34 years old, and for most of my life I have been the quiet one who never asked for much. My father's 65th birthday was coming up, and once again I was the one making sure the details fell neatly into place. I arrived early carrying the gift I had chosen carefully, hoping maybe this year things might feel different. Instead, I walked into a room where every seat was filled, and my sister's voice rang out with a smirk that still echoes in my memory. "Sorry, this table's for family only," she said, pointing me toward a folding chair set by the trash bin. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and be sure to like and subscribe if you've ever known what it feels like to be treated as less in your own family. Growing up, I never doubted that my family loved me, but love in our house didn't look the same for everyone. My sister Vanessa was celebrated for every small triumph. She was the one who sparkled at talent shows, who had her pictures framed on the mantle, who was always asked to make the holiday toast. I, on the other hand, was steady. I got the grades, kept the house in order, and stayed out of trouble. But none of those things drew applause. My mother liked to say, Vanessa had charm, as if that explained why my efforts were overlooked while I blended into the background. I learned early not to draw attention to myself. If Vanessa needed something, she asked, and more often than not, it was given. If I needed something, I figured out how to fix it on my own. When my car broke down in high school, I patched it up without help. When my name wasn't mentioned in a family toast, I smiled and passed the gravy. I told myself it was fine, that asking for acknowledgement would look like begging, and I didn't want pity. When I became an adult, I moved 3 states away and built a life of my own. I started a small marketing firm, learned to manage on my own terms, and carved out a kind of independence I could be proud of. Still, I kept showing up for family, sending cards on holidays, helping with last-minute bills, transferring money for unexpected repairs. They never had to ask directly because they assumed I would step in, and I always did. Some part of me still wanted to believe they'd notice, that they'd see me as someone more than the reliable hand in the background. So when my mother called and said Dad's birthday dinner would be special, I agreed to handle the deposit without hesitation. It was at an elegant restaurant my father loved, and I told myself it was worth it. After all, what was one more gesture? I showed up early, wearing a satin dress I hadn't worn in years, clutching the gift I had wrapped carefully. I told myself I'd finally be seated among them, not outside of them. But when I stepped into that private dining room and saw every place at the grand table already claimed, my hope dissolved. Vanessa looked up from her wine glass, tilted her head, and with that glint in her eye motioned toward the fold-out chair by the wall. Laughter flickered around the table, and not one person told her to stop. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I walked to that chair, sat down with my coat still on, and tried to swallow the sting of humiliation. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was used to being overlooked. But as I watched them raise their glasses and laugh together while I sat apart, I realized I had finally reached a breaking point. What I didn't know yet was that before the night was over, I would take the first step toward changing everything. The restaurant was warm with soft lighting, the kind that made everything glow a little more golden than real life. At the long mahogany table, every seat was full, glasses raised, and conversation lively. From where I stood, it looked like a photograph, polished and complete. Then Vanessa's eyes caught mine, and with her head tilted just slightly, she set me apart from it. Her hand lifted toward the folding chair near the trash bin, and the words rolled out in that smooth, cutting way of hers. "Sorry, this table's for family only." Laughter came from somewhere down the table, quick and light, but it struck like an echo I couldn't escape. My mother's hand fluttered in a small wave before she turned her face toward the candles. My father didn't look up at all. I carried my gift in both hands, unsure where to put it, unsure where to put myself, until my body moved without thought. I walked to the chair, slid into it, and rested the box at my feet. The scent of lemon peels and shrimp shells drifted from the bus cart beside me. For a moment, I told myself it didn't matter that it was only a seat, but the sound of glasses clinking, of their voices rising and falling with ease, made the distance stretch further than a few feet. Vanessa laughed loudly at something our cousin said, leaning across the table as though her world brimmed with light. I sat quietly in my coat hands, folded in my lap, waiting for the moment to pass. The waiter came over, glanced at the arrangement, and paused. "Part of this party?" he asked. I nodded, keeping my answer small. He set a single glass of water in front of me and walked away, leaving the menus untouched. I watched as dishes began to appear on the main table plates of roasted lamb bowls of greens tossed with candied nuts, baskets of bread with butter melting against the cloth. Their laughter rose again, layered and unbroken. Vanessa stood not long after her cream dress catching the light and lifted her glass for a toast. Everyone hushed. She spoke about Dad's years of hard work, about his love of golf and family trips. My mother wiped her eyes, and my father's face shone with pride as she presented a framed photo from their summer in Cape Cod. The picture had everyone smiling against the dunes, everyone but me, because I hadn't been there. I studied their faces locked together in memory and pressed my hands against my knees to keep still. Minutes stretched into hours. I stayed seated watching as desserts were carried in, as champagne fizzed in their glasses. Not one person turned to ask if I wanted to order. Not one asked if I had a story or a memory to share. My gift sat on the floor, untouched, the navy paper, gathering faint creases from my shoes. Around me, waiters bustled, trays rattled, and the trash bin filled steadily, but at the main table, nothing shifted. Then a waiter approached with a black folder in hand, slim and discreet but heavy in what it carried. He opened it, slightly glanced at the name on the slip, and scanned the room. His eyes found mine. The restaurant grew quiet as he stepped closer. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly. "The total is $4,912. Would you like me to run it on the same card used for the deposit?" The sound stilled the room. Forks hovered midair. Vanessa froze with her glass raised. My mother's jaw tightened, and even the cousins who had been whispering stopped. All eyes turned toward me at once, as if I had been invisible until that moment. I looked up at the waiter and answered without hesitation. Not my table. The silence held sharp edges. It cut through the shine of the chandeliers, through the layers of laughter that had filled the evening. Someone gasped faintly, and my sister's face flushed red beneath her careful makeup. "Emily," she hissed, her voice low and sharp. "Don't do this." "I'm not doing anything," I replied, my voice steady. "I was told this table was for family." My father shifted, clearing his throat. "Emily, honey, come on. You already covered half. Might as well just finish it." The words landed harder than I expected. Might as well. As though my silence, my steady hand, my presence at the edge had always meant consent. I rose from the chair slowly, the scrape of its legs across the floor breaking the stillness like a blade. "You're right, Dad," I said quietly. "I did pay the deposit. I made the reservation. I gave up my weekend to plan this." My gaze moved toward Vanessa, and for that, I was given a folding chair and a place beside the trash. My eyes swept across the table, meeting theirs one by one. "So now you can figure out the rest." I turned and walked toward the exit, each step deliberate, my heels striking against the floor like a punctuation mark no one could erase. Behind me, the waiter still held the folder, uncertain, frozen in the moment. And for the first time that night, no one laughed. The stairs outside were marble cool beneath my feet as I descended. The February air met me like a wall sharp against my face, but I welcomed it. My hands shook as I removed my earrings, unclasped my coat, and let the wind carry the heat from my chest. I walked block after block until the restaurant lights were only aglow behind me. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone had already begun to buzz. Messages filled the screen one after another. My mother pleading for me to call my father, saying I had embarrassed them all, and Vanessa accusing me of making the night about myself. I let the phone dim without answering. Then a name I hadn't expected appeared. Madison, my sister's ex-girlfriend. I stared at it for a moment before picking up. Her voice was soft, almost uncertain. Emily. Hi. I hope this is okay. I was at the dinner tonight. I blinked, pressing the phone to my ear. You were there? Yes, she said. I came with Claire. Vanessa told everyone I was just a friend from yoga. She gave a dry laugh before continuing. But I saw what happened. I wanted to tell you. I've always seen it. Seen what I asked quietly. The way they treat you. Like you're just there to clean up the mess or cover the bill or keep the peace. And the way Vanessa talks about you, it's cruel, Emily. It has been for years. Her words settled slowly, heavier than the night air. Why are you telling me this now? Because you walked out, she said, and they didn't expect it. You shook something tonight. When the call ended, I stood in the quiet of my kitchen, the unopened gift still in my bag, the bottle of wine resting untouched on the counter. I thought about the table, the chair by the wall, and the silence that followed my words. It had felt like the end of something sharp and sudden, but in truth, it was only the beginning. When I finally set the phone down after speaking with Madison, the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. The unopened bottle of wine I had carried to dinner still sat on the counter, catching the faint light from the street outside. The gift box remained in my bag untouched, as though I had imagined carrying it through the night. For the first time, I stood still long enough to hear my own breathing and realize I wasn't shaking from anger. It was something else entirely, something closer to release. Not long after the vibration of my phone broke the quiet. One message after another spilled across the screen, each one sharper than the last. My mother begged me to call, insisting I had hurt my father. My father wrote that I had embarrassed the family in front of everyone, as if my leaving had caused the fracture, not the chair by the wall. Vanessa's words were the harshest. You humiliated me, she wrote. You ruined everything. I let the phone grow still again, watching the notifications fade into darkness. I made tea, carried the cup into the living room, and sat down without turning on the lights. Outside, the February night pressed against the glass. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and tried not to replay the sound of the room falling silent when I told the waiter it wasn't my table. Minutes turned into hours. The messages didn't stop. At one point, my father's voice came through in a voicemail, weary and stern. Emily, enough. Just apologize and let's move on. I listened once, then deleted it. My mother left her own softer in tone but heavy with insistence. Please, sweetheart, call us. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be. I closed my eyes and set the phone face down. The next afternoon, another message arrived, this time not in text, but in sound. Vanessa's voice carried through in a voice note brittle with accusation. I hope you're happy, she said. You made Dad's birthday all about you. You always play the victim. Maybe if you weren't so cold, people would actually want you at the table. Her laugh at the end was hollow, sharp as glass. I listened only once before archiving it. But the words stayed circling my mind until I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder where I had kept every receipt from the past week. The deposit for the restaurant, the invoice for flowers, the print I had ordered as a gift, the driver service I had arranged for my mother so she wouldn't have to worry about parking. Each line item sat in black and white, unshakable, undeniable. I opened a new email and began to type. The subject line was short, last night. In the body, I wrote clearly attaching every receipt. I explained what I had covered, how much each expense had been, and the fact that no one had offered reimbursement. I reminded them that I had agreed because the night was supposed to honor Dad, not because I expected anything in return. But I ended with the truth they couldn't ignore. I had not eaten, had not been seated, and had not been welcome. I would not pay the remaining balance. I read the email twice, steadying myself, and then pressed send. The sound of it leaving my outbox was softer than I expected, like the closing of a door. Responses came sooner than I thought. My cousin Jenna, who had stayed quiet during the dinner, was the first. "Good for you," she wrote. "We saw what happened. It was cruel." Not long after, Uncle Leo replied with a simple admission. "Wish I'd spoken up. I'm sorry." Even Aunt Karen, who rarely said anything that wasn't wrapped in judgment, responded with only 4 words. About time someone said it. The support surprised me. But what struck deeper was the silence that followed from my parents and Vanessa. Hours passed, then the rest of the day without a word from them. Only late that night did another notification arrive, not from anyone I had expected, but from an unknown number. "Hi, this is Claire," the message began. "We met once at a wedding. I'm Madison's friend. I just wanted to say your email is making the rounds. People are talking, and they're not on Vanessa's side this time." I leaned back in my chair and read it again. The words were simple, but they shifted something inside me. For so long I had poured into a family that only reached for me when they needed something. Now, for once, the tide was turning without me chasing it. That night, I opened my banking app and scrolled to the shared account I had quietly kept for emergencies. Over the years, it had paid for Vanessa's broken air conditioner, Dad's dental work, and Mom's countless short-term, just-until expenses. None of them had asked with gratitude. They had simply assumed I would take care of it, and I always had. The balance was just under $30,000. I hovered over the transfer button, breathing deeply, before moving the entire amount into my personal savings. Then, with a few more taps, I closed the account for good. My phone rang almost immediately after. Vanessa's name lit up the screen. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before finally answering on the 4th. Her voice came in hot, sharp with anger. "What the hell, Emily? The joint fund is gone. I just tried to pay my car note, and I closed it," I said flatly. "You what?" "You can't. I can," I interrupted, and I did. The silence on the line was thick. I let it hold until I spoke again. I paid for dinner. I paid for flowers, for transportation. I sat alone, got laughed at, and was still expected to pay for the rest while being told I wasn't family. That account was the last tie. "Now it's gone. You're being vindictive," she snapped. "No," I said calmly. "I'm being done." For the first time, Vanessa's voice cracked, not with apology, but with disbelief. "You've never talked to me like this before." I exhaled slowly. "That's because I used to think I had to earn love by staying quiet. But love that only shows up when I'm useful isn't love at all." I ended the call and placed the phone on the table beside me. In the stillness that followed, I felt the weight of years shift, leaving space where silence had once lived. But the night wasn't finished. Before I could close my laptop, another message appeared on the screen. This time from my father. The subject line was short, "Emily, I owe you an apology." I stared at it for a long moment, the cursor hovering above the unopened message. My heart pounded not from fear, but from the possibility of something I hadn't known to expect. With one click, I opened it. The email from my father sat open on the screen, shorter than I expected, but steady in tone. He admitted he hadn't seen what had been happening for years, that Vanessa's presence had filled the room while I had made it easy to be overlooked. He wrote that he was sorry, There was no excuse attached, no request for me to fix what had been broken. It was the first time in my life I had heard him claim responsibility without expecting me to carry the rest. I leaned back in my chair, reading it twice, then a third time. It wasn't flowery or warm, but the words were plain and unshaken. For a long moment, I simply stared, unsure what to do with the message. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I let it rest there in acknowledgement that something had shifted, even if only by a small degree. The days that followed were quieter than any I could remember. The family group chat, once filled with photos of birthday cakes and forwarded jokes, went silent. My phone stopped buzzing at odd hours with sudden requests. No one asked for a transfer to cover a repair. No one reminded me of another family dinner. At first, the quiet felt strange, like a missing sound I kept expecting to hear. But as the hours passed, I began to welcome it. I started walking in the evenings, tracing the same loop around my neighborhood, until the cold bit at my cheeks. I cooked for one without glancing at my phone. Some nights I lit candles while I worked, letting the shadows dance across the walls, without worrying about anyone else's schedule. Slowly, I began to notice the absence of tension, the way my shoulders stayed lower when the phone stayed dark. After a week, I decided to take a step I had postponed for too long. I found a therapist and made an appointment, not because I felt broken, but because I wanted to speak in a space where I wasn't interrupted or dismissed. Sitting across from her during that first session, I found myself explaining more than I had ever said out loud. How silence in my family was treated as peace, how the word family had been used like a closed door, and how I had learned to keep giving without expecting anything back. She listened quietly, only nodding, and when I paused, she asked a question that stayed with me. What would it look like to draw a boundary, not out of anger, but out of care for yourself? I carried those words home, rolling them over in my mind long after the session ended. In the following weeks, I began practicing small changes. When Vanessa called again, I let it ring. When my mother texted about a recipe she wanted me to send, I waited until the next day to answer, instead of rushing to respond. I didn't feel guilty for the pauses anymore. Each quiet no was its own kind of protection, a step towards something I hadn't realized I could claim. I booked a trip I had canceled twice before a long weekend in Santa Fe I had always put aside to attend family gatherings. This time I didn't cancel. I packed light, brought a notebook, and boarded the plane without telling anyone in advance. The city was sunlit and open, its markets filled with bright colors, and its streets lined with adobe walls. I walked through art stalls, letting the weight of family obligations slip away with every step. One morning, I sat outside a small cafe with coffee warming my hands and began writing a list, not of tasks or expenses, but of the things I no longer wanted to carry. I wrote that I could say no without apology. I wrote that solitude was not the same as loneliness. I wrote that love without respect was performance. Line after line, the page filled with truths I had hidden from myself for years. By the third day, I realized I no longer felt the urge to check my phone for messages that might demand something of me. I walked through the plaza at sunrise, the sky streaked with pale pink, and I felt something like space open inside me. It wasn't dramatic, not a sudden revelation, but a slow easing I hadn't known I needed. When I returned home, I unpacked carefully, setting the small items I had bought in places around my apartment. A woven scarf on the back of a chair, a handmade cup by the sink. Each piece felt like proof that I could choose what to carry into my life and what to leave behind. One evening, not long after, I scrolled through my phone and came across a photograph posted by someone who had been at the dinner. The table gleamed under soft lights full of laughter and glasses raised in mid-toast. And in the background, blurred but clear enough, was me still in my coat, sitting alone by the trash can. I stared at the image for a long time, but instead of sharp pain, I felt confirmation. That version of me had shown up, gift in hand, waiting for permission to belong. That version was gone now. I closed the photo, set the phone aside, and turned toward the stack of invitations I had been writing. The following weekend, I opened my door to the sound of friends arriving. Just 6 of us, no cousins, no uncles, no family obligations. We crowded around my own dining table, mismatched plates, set out a simple roast in the center. There was laughter, loud and free, and no one needed to ask where they belonged. Halfway through the evening, my friend Talia lifted her glass and said, "To Emily for reminding us that family isn't always blood." The room warmed with clinking glasses, with voices raised together, and I realized I was no longer waiting at the edges of someone else's table. I had built my own. Still, even in that warmth, I knew there were words I had not yet heard, apologies that had not yet come. And one of them was closer than I expected, waiting to arrive in a way that would stop me cold. The night of my dinner with friends had ended with laughter that lingered long after they left. I cleaned the plates slowly, letting the quiet of my apartment feel like part of the evening rather than its end. For once, I didn't check my phone before bed. I woke the next morning to a stillness I had begun to trust, and then noticed the envelope waiting in the mail pile by the door. The handwriting across it was familiar, curved and careful, a script I had seen on every birthday card since childhood. My mother's. There was no return address, only my name written in her deliberate hand. I carried it to the table and opened it slowly. Inside was a short note on plain stationery. She wrote that she had reread my email 5 times. She admitted she hadn't realized how far things had gone, how quiet I had become in order to stay close. She wrote the words I had never heard from her in my life. I was wrong. I set the paper down, folding it neatly, not out of anger, but with the weight of something fragile. It was the first time she had put the words in writing without adding conditions, without turning them back on me. I didn't cry. I didn't rush to respond. Instead, I placed it in the drawer beside my journal, closed it gently, and returned to the cup of tea I had left on the counter. The following week, I went back to my therapist and shared the letter. She asked how it felt to read it. I thought about it for a moment before answering, like a beginning, not a solution. The words settled between us, and I realized they were true. Apologies did not erase years, but they marked the first small step towards something different. Even with her note, the family group chat remained quiet. My father hadn't followed his email with another message, and Vanessa had gone silent since the call where I closed the account. It was as though the space I had created for myself was keeping the noise at bay. At first, the emptiness felt odd, but as the days turned into weeks, it grew into something steady. I spent more time with friends, letting evenings stretch long without worrying about what might be waiting in my inbox. I walked in the morning, sometimes stopping at the park with coffee in hand, watching the light shift through the trees. On weekends, I visited the farmer's market with Talia, carrying bags of fresh bread and fruit back to my apartment. These rhythms felt new, but also like something I had been reaching for quietly all along. Still, reminders of the past came in unexpected ways. One afternoon, scrolling through my phone, I found another photograph from the dinner. The long table glowed beneath chandeliers, faces smiling and glasses lifted. And again, blurred but clear enough, I was in the background, coat still on, seated by the trash bin. I stared at it longer than I expected, letting the image sink in. The sting was gone. Instead, it confirmed what I already knew: that version of me no longer existed. Later that evening, I sat at my own table, a notebook open, and began writing rules for myself. They weren't rules for others, only for me. I wrote that no one who made me feel invisible would eat first. I wrote that silence was not grace when it cost me dignity. I wrote that I did not need to beg for a seat at their table if I could build my own. Line by line, the page filled with words that would guide me, not chain me. In the weeks that followed, I began to feel lighter. When messages from extended family trickled in short notes of support or quiet acknowledgments of what they had seen that night, I read them with gratitude, but I didn't feel the need to respond quickly. For years, I had been the one to soothe, to explain, to cover gaps no one else noticed. Now I let the pauses stay where they belonged. My evenings grew into something fuller. I hosted another dinner smaller than the first, with mismatched plates and a simple stew that simmered for hours. We ate slowly, with music playing low in the background, and when the night ended, I stood at the door watching my friends leave with smiles and leftovers. I closed the door and felt something quiet but undeniable peace. Yet even in that peace, I knew Vanessa would not stay silent forever. The account was closed, the tide had turned, but she had not had the last word. I could sense it waiting, a storm I would need to face, though this time not in the way I once had. Vanessa's silence didn't last. It began with a string of missed calls, each one flashing across my phone late into the night. I ignored the first few, letting them ring out, but by the next afternoon, she had left messages that grew sharper with every attempt. When I finally answered, her voice came through fast and furious. "What have you done, Emily? People are talking about your email. Do you realize how humiliating this is for me?" I held the phone steady, waiting until she stopped to catch her breath. "I sent the truth," I said plainly. "Nothing more than that." "That wasn't your place," she snapped. "You've made me look like some kind of villain." "You don't need my help for that," I replied quietly. The line went silent for a beat, and I could almost hear her struggling for words. "You think cutting off the account makes you powerful? It makes you petty," she said finally. "You've always been jealous of me, and now you're proving it." I let her words fall, not rushing to fill the pause. When I spoke again, my tone was steady. "That account was mine to close. I don't owe you access to my work, my time, or my money. Not anymore." Her voice cracked thinner now. "You've never stood up to me like this before. That's because I used to believe love meant silence," I said. "But silence only served you. It never served me." She exhaled hard, muttered something I couldn't make out, and then hung up. I set the phone on the counter and stood there in the quiet, realizing I wasn't shaking the way I once would have. That weekend, I met Talia for coffee at a small shop downtown. She listened as I told her about the call, about the way Vanessa's voice had shifted from anger to disbelief. Talia stirred her cup slowly before speaking. "She doesn't know who you are without the version of you that always gives in. That's why she's spiraling." I nodded, absorbing her words. It was true. For years, I had been the steady backdrop against which Vanessa's drama played out. Now that backdrop was gone, and she didn't know what to do with the empty space. The days that followed brought more quiet. My father didn't write again, though his first apology stayed saved in my inbox. My mother's note remained in the drawer unopened since the day I placed it there. Vanessa sent no more calls after our last conversation. At work, I threw myself into projects, finishing a campaign I had been putting off, and at night, I found myself cooking meals from scratch, filling my apartment with the scents of garlic and rosemary. It felt like life was expanding in ways I hadn't expected. Then one evening, as I folded laundry, another message arrived, this time from Madison. "You okay?" she wrote. "I heard Vanessa is spinning stories about you trying to blame everyone else for what happened." I hesitated before replying. "I'm fine," I typed. "She can say what she wants. I'm not part of it anymore." Madison responded a few minutes later. "Good. Let her spiral. You're not her axis." I set the phone down, reading her words again in the quiet. Something about them struck me as final, as though a door had closed that I didn't need to open again. The next morning, my inbox held a surprise. Another message from my father. The subject line was plain, "Dinner." I clicked it open, bracing myself. His words were short again, but firm. "I don't know what happens from here, but I want to be clear. I see now what I missed. If you ever want to sit down, I'll listen. I read it twice, then closed my laptop. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was acknowledgement. And for the first time, it wasn't tied to money obligation or silence. It was just recognition. Later that week, I walked through the park near my apartment, the trees still bare from winter. Children ran past with kites, their voices carrying high in the cold air. I thought about the years I had spent showing up at every family dinner, carrying gifts and smiles, waiting to be noticed. I thought about the chair by the trash bin, about the silence that followed when I told the waiter it wasn't my table. And then I thought about the steady beat of my own footsteps now carrying me forward, without waiting for anyone else to set the pace. That night I sat at my desk with my journal open and wrote down a sentence I hadn't dared before. I don't need their permission to exist fully. The words looked small on the page, but saying them out loud to the quiet room felt like a turning point. Still, even as I wrote them, I knew there was more ahead. A storm always waits after the calm, and with Vanessa, the storm never stayed far away. The weeks after Vanessa's last outburst stretched into something quieter than I thought possible. I went to work, came home, and filled my evenings with small routines that belonged only to me. I watered the plants I had neglected, rearranged books on my shelves, and let music drift through the apartment without anyone else's interruptions. For the first time, silence wasn't heavy. It was steady, even welcome. Then one morning, as I sorted through emails before leaving for the office, a subject line stopped me cold. It was from my father. "Emily, I owe you an apology." My hands hovered above the keys before I opened it. His message was brief. He admitted he hadn't seen how often I had been overlooked. He wrote that Vanessa always took up space, and I had made it easy for them not to notice. "That's on me," he ended. "I'm sorry. If you ever want to talk, I'll listen." I read it twice, maybe 3 times, and then closed the laptop. The words didn't erase what had happened, but they were the clearest acknowledgement I had ever received from him. There was no request for me to fix, no guilt woven into the sentences. Just recognition. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I carried the weight of his words with me through the day, letting them rest in the back of my mind as I sat through meetings and crossed errands off a list. That night, I returned home, poured myself tea, and pulled the letter from my mother out of the drawer where I had kept it. Between her note and my father's email, something unfamiliar stirred in me a sense that maybe at last they had begun to see what I had endured. Still, I didn't rush to forgive. I folded her letter back into its envelope, shut my laptop, and sat with the quiet. Recognition was not repair, but it was a start. The family group chat, once buzzing with messages, stayed mostly empty. An occasional meme from my aunt slipped in, but my parents and Vanessa left it silent. No more reminders about holidays, no invitations to gatherings, no requests for me to cover expenses. At first it felt strange, like walking into a room where the usual noise had been switched off. Then as the days stretched on, I realized I didn't miss it. Instead, I filled my time with things I had put off. I started attending a pottery class at a studio near my apartment, my hands sinking into clay as the instructor guided us through simple shapes. On weekends, I visited the market with Talia, carrying bags of produce back to cook meals we shared at my place. We laughed late into the night, and when she left, I didn't feel the emptiness I once associated with quiet. It was during one of those dinners that Talia looked across the table and said, "You know you're different now. You're lighter." I smiled, not with dismissal, but with an understanding I hadn't been able to reach before. One evening, scrolling through my camera roll, I paused at a photo I hadn't noticed before. It had been taken at the birthday dinner, likely by one of my cousins. The table glowed under chandeliers, every seat full faces bright with laughter, And there I was, blurred in the background, coat still on, seated by the trash can. I stared at it for a long moment. Instead of the sharp sting I once expected, the image only confirmed what I already knew. That woman, the one waiting quietly at the edge, still carrying a gift, was no longer me. She had stayed too long in silence. I set the phone down and turned back to my journal. I wrote out a list I had begun weeks earlier, rules for the table I was building for myself. The rules weren't about dinner or gatherings. They were about how I would carry my worth forward. No one who made me feel invisible would be welcome first. Love without respect would not be mistaken for love at all. Silence would not be mistaken for peace. And above all, I didn't need their invitation to take my seat. I had built my own table. A few days later, as I was sorting the mail, another envelope appeared. The handwriting was my mother's again. I opened it at the kitchen counter, the words simple and plain. She admitted she hadn't realized how far things had gone, how wrong she had been to let it continue. She wrote that if I never came back, she understood. But if I ever did, she promised she would not seat me by the trash again. I folded the letter carefully, placing it with the first, and sat for a long time in the quiet of my apartment. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was something steadier, something rooted. Recognition had come in words I had waited decades to hear, but I knew then that closure was not about returning. It was about finally stepping forward without carrying the weight of being overlooked. I placed my mother's second letter in the drawer beside the first, closed it softly, and let the quiet of the room settle. For years I had longed for words like those, some sign that my parents understood the harm of forgetting me in plain sight. And now, when they finally arrived, I didn't rush to frame them or press them close. I let them rest not as anchors, but as acknowledgments. In the weeks that followed, I began building rhythms that felt entirely mine. I cooked meals I enjoyed, lit candles while I worked, and left my phone face down without worry. I walked to the market on Saturdays, sometimes with Talia, sometimes alone, and filled my home with small pieces of joy. There was no need to ask permission, no need to wait for someone else to grant me a place. One evening I hosted another dinner at my own table. Friends gathered with mismatched plates and laughter that rose easily. There was no seating chart, no one left to the side, no performance of belonging. Halfway through the meal, Talia raised her glass with a smile. "To Emily for showing us that family can be chosen." The words settled around me like warmth, and I realized I was no longer standing outside the circle. I was right where I belonged. Later that night, I sat at my desk and returned to the list I had started in Santa Fe. I wrote new rules for my table, the one inside me where dignity and worth were served first. No one who diminished me would have a seat. Love that carried conditions would not masquerade as love. Silence would no longer be mistaken for peace when it cost me my voice. And above all, I didn't need their invitation. I could build my own table, and it would always be enough. The truth is, the greatest change didn't come from the letters or the apology. It came from the moment I chose to walk away from a table where I wasn't welcome. Every quiet no that followed became its own kind of justice, not loud or showy, but steady and real. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sitting by the trash waiting to be noticed. I was home seated at a table I had made myself. And maybe that's the lesson I carry now, that dignity isn't something anyone else can hand to you. It's something you claim when you stop asking to be included and start creating space where you belong. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know, have you ever had to build your own table when someone shut you out of theirs? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if stories like this resonate with you.